As announced a few days ago, I am writing a book about the history of American cricket called The Second Innings. And it's not just a straight history, it's based on my front seat that I had for the soccer revolution, or the football, that's what I prefer to call the sport, but the soccer revolution as it's called in the United States. And my understanding of kind of how immigration patterns and how American history have shaped just general cricket history in the United States and Canada. In fact, this book, as I get into writing it, there's a lot on Canada. It's tough to separate the United States from Canada, especially with the way I have written my historical books, which views British North America as kind of a unified set of colonies with unified values that split politically, but often kept a lot of the same culture. So that would mean Canada, a lot of the same cultural currents between Canada and the United States, which I think is played out in a sporting sense in general. I'm going to, I've more than 10,000 words into writing this book, but I'm going to read on this podcast my introduction to kind of just tease the book. So under the glare of the lights in Grand Prairie and the new Pomona facility that opened very recently in Major League Cricket, Pomona, California, a revolution is happening in American sports. Cricket is being played at a high level in its T20 form, now the most popular form of the sport globally. Fans in India and Australia and England flock to their iPads, televisions, and phones to watch a cricket competition happening on American soil, which is pretty amazing. If you tune into an MLC broadcast today, you are met with a sensory overload of modern entertainment, really. And to the casual observer, the American sports fan raised on baseball and on American football, cricket feels in many ways like a really well-funded and well-produced television program, which is a foreign invasion like K-pop or Bollywood movies or any number of British things that have invaded the United States, whether it's music, whether it's James Bond movies, whether it's Austin Powers, right? Very anglicized things. It looks like an imported spectacle brought over from London, Mumbai, Melbourne, Barbados, wherever, Kingston. So the 2024 ICC T20 Men's World Cup, which I had a catbird seat for working the tournament, was being co-hosted by the United States with three host cities, Dallas, New York, and Fort Lauderdale. We're going to get into the Fort Lauderdale angle in a little bit because this is an important reason why I'm writing this book, or Broward County, let's call it Lauderhill. That even what you call it is contentious. So I'm in the book, I'm going to alternate between the Fort Lauderdale area, Broward County, and Lauderhill specifically. Okay, I'm not calling the venue Fort Lauderdale. I know that causes a lot of backlash locally. It was that World Cup was sold as the birth of a big-time American cricket culture, like the '94 FIFA World Cup was here in football soccer. Now, which is the sport I've spent the majority of my adult life working on. But like that World Cup, there was a cricket culture that existed. I got into soccer because I was a ball boy in the early 1980s for the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. And the sport was already declining in this country then. The big revolution had been in the 70s. It was, if you think about the history of the Tampa Bay Rowdies, the New York Cosmos, Seattle Sounders, Fort Lauderdale Strikers, right, Portland Timbers, it was amazing. And then not to mention the Canadian teams like Vancouver Whitecaps. But here's the thing that a lot of people don't get. Long before baseball became the national pastime, cricket was the undisputed king of the North American colonies. Benjamin Franklin brought over the 1744 laws of cricket back from England to ensure the game was being played properly in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is an important part of the entire narrative I'm going to talk about in this book. When George Washington's Continental Army was freezing to death at Valley Forge, just outside Philadelphia, they didn't pass the time throwing a baseball or playing tackle football, playing the eventual game of American football. They played wicket, which was a American variant of cricket, right? Just like football, soccer has its indigenous forms, cricket has its indigenous forms, which I've, even with a codification of the rules, I've pointed out quite quite openly recently about why I think India struggles when they go to the British Isles because of the climate and because they now have the most valuable leagues. This is the same deal as I've said for years with England and football, right? Well, because so many guys were just playing exclusively in the Premier League. They would struggle when they went abroad. Same thing with Indian players when they leave the subcontinent, or conditions like the subcontinent. Now in Florida, we have conditions like the subcontinent. So when they've come to Lauderhill, they've done quite well, India. After independence, which in my historian's hat, under my historian's hat, I consider a partition of North America, and I've written about this before. So partition, 13 colonies of North America rebelled against the crown and gained their independence. 14 other colonies stayed loyal, including the colonies in the Caribbean, including where I live, Florida, although they ended up being ceded to Spain in the peace treaty. And importantly for our story, Upper and Lower Canada, and really importantly for our story, the West Indies, stay loyal to the British Crown. In 1844, before Australia ever played England in cricket, before India ever played England in cricket, before England and Scotland played in football, the United States played Canada, the first ever international match in any sport, in cricket. First match ever. Decades before the modern Olympic Games, the U.S. and Canada met in Manhattan for a cricket match. And so then how did the sport disappear? I'm going to discuss in the book the period between immediately after the Civil War when baseball gained its foothold, partly because of what happened during the Civil War. And then there was a built-in Anglophobia that also kind of eventually pushed football/soccer out later, which was a working class English game. And keep in mind, cricket was an aristocratic game. Football is a working class game. So different. This is why English sailors brought football to Uruguay and Paraguay and Chile and Argentina. English merchants brought football to Italy and to Spain. But it was English elites, colonial administrators, who brought cricket to India, to the West Indies, to Africa, and ultimately also to the United States and Canada. So keep that in mind. And because part of the issue with football's development, which I'm going to talk about in the book, in the U.S. was, even though we had ethnic communities that played it, particularly in St. Louis and New York, New Jersey, because the U.S. was actually competing with England and the United Kingdom to be the leading economic power in the world. British merchants, English merchants, were spending more time in places like Uruguay, as I mentioned, than in Philadelphia or in Boston by that time, or Los Angeles. So the sport developed in a stronger way in other places. And even in places like Milan and Napoli, English merchants were bringing football. But cricket has had its revival in the United States because of the waves of immigration that have come from the Caribbean and from the Indian subcontinent post-1965. And this is a big part of our story. And this is where Broward County, my hometown, comes in. Broward County is heavily West Indian, as I think people realize. And it was that community from Trinidad, Guyana, Barbados, Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, those sorts, St. Lucia. It was that community in Broward County that created local leagues in the 1990s, like the ethnic football leagues you used to see in New Jersey and in St. Louis and Chicago, right? Same sort of story just a couple decades later, that fueled those ethnic football leagues, fueled the beginning of the NASL and the soccer boom of the 70s. The cricket leagues in South Florida, particularly in Broward County, particularly in Western Broward County, in Lauderhill, Lauderdale Lakes, Plantation, those parts, they and here in Coral Springs, where I am, they fueled a cricket revolution. And we had some smart local politicians who I criticized at the time because I'm a soccer football person. I said, you know what? Why is Broward County wasting all this money, taxpayer money, building cricket facilities? They should be building soccer facilities. Well, someone who I'm going to mention in the book, she was Broward County Commissioner Eileen Lieberman. She was from Lauderhill. And the mayor of Lauderhill, Richard Kaplan, at the time, they realized they had this West Indian community. They had this potential in this massive international sport to make Broward County a hub. Even though it was a sport no one knew or thought about in the United States outside of Broward County, except maybe, we'll get to the diaspora from the Indian subcontinent in a minute. So Broward County builds the first ICC-rated, World Cup-ready facility in North America, or if we consider the Caribbean North America, north of Jamaica. There's no facility in Canada or the United States when Central Broward Regional Park opens in 2007. And that spurs a cricket revolution. Now, there are all kinds of governance problems in USACA, which govern, and now in USA Cricket. Much like I've experienced in soccer, football myself, governance issues always seem to plague American sports. Look at the U.S. Olympic Committee. But the sport develops with hiccups. There were definite hiccups in the 2010s because of what happened here in Broward County. Now let's enter the Indian diaspora and the Pakistani diaspora that comes to the United States and to Canada also. So obviously Canada actually, I think, has, in terms of the percentage of their population that is is diaspora from South Asia, has the highest percentage of any English-speaking country. Actually, I think of any country outside the Indian subcontinent or the Middle East. So it develops in Canada also, but the funding and the interest in cricket, the interest in broadcasting cricket so you can watch IPL matches, the interest in broadcasting cricket so you can watch India's test matches, India's one-day internationals, India's T20 matches, comes because of the large Indian diaspora and how wealthy they are. And then the Pakistani diaspora kind of follows that. And then you get well-funded cricket investment in places like Silicon Valley, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas in particular, with its huge Indian diaspora, North Carolina, the Triangle area, to complement what we had built here in Broward County with our West Indian community, which doesn't quite have the financial backing, unfortunately. I mean, just from our local perspective, that all of these places with Indian and Pakistani diaspora does. So now you have aggressive investment in cricket in the U.S. and Canada by folks from Silicon Valley, because so many of them are Indian, quite frankly. And then you have leading industrialists like Ross Perot Jr. putting a lot of money into cricket in the United States because of the Indian diaspora in the Dallas area, in the Dallas DFW Metroplex. So it's kind of a journey that's coming full circle, and the sport is to put it the way I want to put it, coming home to the United States, because it was the original massive game, the most popular team sport in the United States in the early days of the Republic, and was the most popular team sport in Canada as well in their latter stages as a British colony, right? They get independence. I mean, Canada becomes effectively independent in 1867, although I know they still have the king as their sovereign. So some people would argue, oh, they're not a republic, they're still part of the UK. But 1867 really is when they became independent from the UK, and that's about the time cricket began to die out in Canada also. Not so ironically, as we will point out in this book.